Let's start this in a timely fashion. Good evening, I guess, slash afternoon, potentially, and you never know, maybe even a morning. Good evening, everybody. I'm here in Dublin. I'm Maura Conway. I'm from Dublin City University, Swansea University, and also VOX-Pol. Thanks to those who joined us for the launch of J.M. Berger's The Last Twitter Census, examining baseline metrics for Twitter users during a period of dramatic change. JM's going to give us some of the report's headline findings in a moment, but before he does that, let me say a few words about JM and also Alastair Reid, who joins us this evening too. I guess probably most relevantly for this event, JM is the author of two previous Twitter censuses. 2014's the ISIS Twitter census about the Twitter activity in the sort of 2013, 2014 ISIS, so-called Islamic State activity on Twitter. And for VOX-Pol, 2018's the alt-right Twitter census, both of which are freely accessible online. In addition to the newest census, so the last Twitter census, which we're very happy to say, as this is in fact a launch event, is now appearing online on the VOX-Pol website, free and openly accessible to all of you and anybody else who may be interested. Also joining us, as I said, is Dr. Alastair Reid, who's had an opportunity to read the report already and who's going to give us a brief rejoinder after JM's remarks. Alastair is Associate Professor at the Cyber Threats Research Centre, CYTREC, at Swansea University in the UK, and his research interests overlap with my own and JM's and probably many of yours in terms of addressing issues around terrorist and extremist propaganda and addressing the challenges of countering terrorist and extremist content online. And Alastair's current work is on the ethical challenges of content moderation and post-incident communication strategies in the aftermath of terrorist attacks. JM also has other research ongoing at the present time, which perhaps he can tell us a little bit more about too. But for now, and before I pass the virtual mic over to JM, I just want to say we're going to run from right now to around 6 p.m. my time. So that's for about an hour. We'd like those of you who'd like to contribute to the discussion to do so by popping your questions and comments into the chat box, and I'm going to monitor that and introduce those into the conversation as we proceed over the next 55 minutes or so. Over to you, JM.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for having me and everyone who's come out today for this. So I'm going to give a short presentation, just sort of the headline numbers off of this paper. So the last Twitter census did not start off to be the last Twitter census. We were planning it, to do a paper that would look at control groups for Twitter studies. So the idea was to do a fairly boring but highly citable paper that would give you some metrics about, who's on Twitter and how do they behave, and give you some comparison points for when we're looking at extremist content to say, here's how this differs from the baseline. So, I finished the first round of data collection in October of 2022, which happened to be the month that Elon Musk took over Twitter. And the first round of data collection was finished literally days before Musk took over. As I'm sure you all recall, in the wake of that, there were many dramatic changes to the landscape, including the API was marked for death, the public API. And, there was some question, I think, possibly still persisting, but at the time it was a much more urgent question about whether Twitter was going to, in fact, survive on a technical basis. There were so many people had been laid off that, there were worries the whole infrastructure was going to collapse. So given all this, the utility of the original control group study was diminishing rapidly, because not only was there a possibility there wasn't going to be a Twitter at all anymore, but there was also just so much change happening to the environment that, the typical user in October was going to look nothing like a typical user a year later. So what I did instead is switch gears and started desperately collecting every scrap of data I could for as long as the API was going to survive. So all of this, I just scraped a lot of data. We started off with a data set that consisted of about 100,000 randomly selected accounts that tweet in English, and replicated that in March and January and at different points. So we were able to track a lot of different things that were happening on the platform. And so I'm going to just give a quick overview of some of the changes we saw happening in that time. I've got a couple of slides that are nothing too heavy. Um, the overall thrust of it, I think, if you're taking something away from this, is that, a network the size of Twitter steers like an ocean liner. So, I think that I and many other people expected to see more rapid and dramatic changes as a result of all the changes that Elon Musk was implementing. And what we see is there were definitely measurable changes, but they're maybe not as dramatic as we might have expected. So let me just. So the first data set was collected in the weeks leading up to the purchase of final acquisition of Twitter in October 2022, and it consisted of 100,000 accounts. They were selected by using common English letters, English words that were not prone to be abbreviated. So we used have and of, words that, would just give us a selection, hopefully just, very neutral selection of accounts that were tweeting in English. And so the first collection was pretty uneventful. We grabbed about 110,000 accounts, stuck them into a spreadsheet, and started working on what else we wanted to collect to compare them to. So the major two comparables in this study are the October data set that I just described, and a data set from January 2023, which was collected using the same methodology. So, this January was picked as the date. As some of you know, my methods are API compliant, so I don't, cheat the API. So the collection of this kind of data takes weeks, because I'm complying with the most restrictive rules in order to get the most robust and freest data. So the full data set collections that I was able to finish by January, the writing was on the wall for the API. It had been formally announced the API was on its way out. So I knew that was probably my last chance to get the whole data set down. Since it took, 2 weeks to get the whole of the data, there was not a lot of option to go any further than that. But this is a decent amount of time to pass. So what we saw in this data is that the median friends dropped almost 7% to 544. You will see in the paper that all of the values in here are median, because there were extreme outliers in the data set. And so they really kind of skewed the means in weird ways, depending on what cluster of stuff you have. So you have like the New York Times with like 50 million followers, and then you have 100,000 accounts with 8 followers median. So the median number of friends, people you're following, dropped by 7% to 544. Median number of followers, so the followers on your account, dropped 4.3% to 441. These numbers, I would say, are a little higher than I was expecting. A lot of our previous data collection and the other censuses were included accounts that don't tweet. So there were a lot of zeros and people who tweet almost never. So those accounts were really pulling down some of these averages. Median tweets per day dropped 18.18%. So that was a very sharp change, and I'll go over a couple of factors that are behind this. There were main things that affected these numbers were a bunch of new accounts that were created during this period. We'll take a look at that. A bunch of bots were taken offline during this period, in keeping with Musk's stated policy goals. And, I think the overall vibe on Twitter started to deteriorate pretty quickly, and we can't put a number on how much of this was about that, but some of it certainly was driven by that. So As of February, about 7% of the accounts that we collected in October had been deactivated. Uh, the median deactivated account tweeted almost 40 times per day compared to the baseline of 22.22. Uh, that you, I will say both of those numbers were really quite high to me. I was really surprised to see the baseline tweets per day being that high. Again, that's the zero account factor in some of the previous studies. But the fact that the deactivated accounts were tweeting almost twice as much suggests, and a lot of the other data that we collected strongly suggests that spam is a big portion of why these accounts got deleted. Deactivated accounts included obvious spam. A lot of accounts had to do with sex work or sex trafficking, potentially. We didn't collect any kind of, rich data from the tweets. We only have the text of the tweets in the bio. So, there's a little bit of speculation on that. We don't have the details, but some of these things were obviously sex related. Cryptocurrency stuff also was very highly represented in the deactivated accounts. So a lot of the deactivated accounts were bots of one sort or another. So, I don't have to tell any of you that the, definition of bot is a very flexible thing. People use the word very randomly sometimes. So I'm using it here to talk about accounts that tweet automatically without human intervention. A human being may also operate the account, but most of the account's tweets are sent automatically. And so what we saw was accounts that tweeted more than 200 times a day on average were about 15% of the data set in October. That's pretty high. Some actual users do tweet that often. That's not like an unprecedented number. That's based on how when we collect the data, it's the last 200 tweets from each account. So we can only get the estimate up to 200 tweets per day for that particular measure. The lifetime tweets per day. So tweets per day, of course, the life of the account was much more telling in number. And so there were 0.12% that were tweeting 1,000 times or more a day. And would be highly unusual for a human being to really sustain that, of course, the lifetime of an account. So you can sort of reliably guess that accounts that have a lifetime tweets per day of 1,000 or more are probably automated in some way. Across the board, what we saw, the deactivated accounts we saw these high volume tweeters were disproportionately represented in the deactivated accounts. So a lot of these deactivations were hitting accounts that were tweeting automatically. They may not have been suspended because they were tweeting automatically. It might have been because of explicit sexual content or, spammy or harassing behavior. But, whatever the pro forma reason for the deactivation of the account, it was disproportionately targeted accounts that tweeted a very high amount, and the number of accounts that tweeted a very high amount dropped measurably from October to January. We'll also say that there were definitely some examples of voluntary compliance. So the API changed, and the API changes were announced but not implemented by January. So, the upshot of that was that it was going to start costing people money to tweet 1,000 times a day or 3,000 times a day. And so we did see a lot of accounts just voluntarily stopped in anticipation of that change. And these included like commercial accounts. There was a Japanese account that tweeted about an American fried chicken chain 3,000 times a day. Inexplicably, I have no idea who would follow that, but people did. And so they scaled back to 2 or 3 times a day. So, people who had kind of financial liabilities on that, who aren't just anonymously sending out these tweets, dropped out. So whatever else one says about Elon Musk, when he took over the company, it resulted in the highest month on record of signups, according to the data set I had. October of 2022 just had a huge spike in new signups. So the question is, who are these people, right? So we tried to look at that. You can't really give a big comprehensive answer. A lot of people were probably attracted by novelty. There were probably some commercial bot and automated stand-ups in that period that were seeking to take advantage of the transition period. But what we were able to see is that certain kinds of accounts that had been the subject of announced policy changes did sign up at a higher pace than the overall data set. So, in this chart is showing the rate of signups. It's not showing the absolute number. So keep that in mind. So the blue line is the rate of signups for everybody in the data set. And then we collected two corresponding data sets that were smaller. One was anti-LGBTQ accounts. We identified them by searching for groomer, the phrase groomer. Those accounts spiked in April when it was announced that Elon Musk was serious about acquiring Twitter, and then spiked again in October when he actually did acquire Twitter. Obviously, Musk, you will all, I'm sure, recall that Musk made a point of dropping certain policies as far as anti-LGBTQ content, particularly Twitter had a policy against dead naming trans people that was lifted. So the other comparison group we have here was an anti-vax group. We identified them using the hashtag died suddenly and some related hashtags. People who are spreading anti-COVID, anti-vaccination conspiracy theories, and they showed the same pattern. So they spiked in April when Musk announced he was interested in the company, and they spiked again in October when he took over. So if anything, this is just one piece in the mountain of evidence that content moderation makes a difference. So, if the announced change is to stop a policy, we're going to stop this COVID policy, and then a bunch of people sign up, that suggests that the COVID policy was deterring people from sharing that content. So anti-vax accounts were newer than the median. LGBTQIA plus accounts were older. So that has to do with Twitter having a very strict anti-vax policy and a much looser policy as far as anti-LGBTQIA content. And so those accounts, the anti-vax accounts, were really pretty thoroughly destroyed in the years preceding Musk's takeover. And so a lot of those accounts came back. People who had previously been suspended coming back, or people who created a new account in light of the new policy. Anti-vax followers were more popular than the anti-LGBT content, but not by a huge amount. And both groups tweeted much faster than the median, which sort of falls in line with the research we've had over the years on how extremist content plays. We've consistently seen that extremist and disinformation accounts tweet much faster than other accounts. So I'm going to wrap this up because I'm going to get to the conversation. But as far as the other big piece of the moderation policy is that Musk announced he was having a general amnesty, which was going to, reinstate a lot of suspended accounts. And so there's a researcher named Travis Brown, who tracked very large numbers of these accounts that were being restored. What I did, wanted to ask, the question I wanted to ask, and I was able to ask because of the data I had on hand, was what percentage of previously suspended accounts were being restored. So because of my previous monitoring, I had a collection of about 9,000 COVID disinformation accounts, about 10,000 alt-right accounts, and about 25,000 QAnon accounts that had been definitively suspended in previous crackdowns. And so the rate of restoral varied among these. So it was 4% for COVID, 6.6% for the alt-right, and 2.3% for QAnon. So these add up when you get into the scales of Twitter. These add up to the big numbers that Travis Brown was tracking as far as, the objective number of accounts that were restored was in the, tens of thousands and even hundreds of thousands. But as a percentage of all previous removals, these are relatively low. So, it's kind of open question about what criteria were used to bring these accounts back. Were specific accounts named? Were people who had complaints? Were accounts that were suspended during a specific period? We can't really answer that. Out of the accounts that came back, not all of them resumed tweeting. So COVID disinformation, it probably had the highest rate of resuming tweeting, with 3% alt-right accounts. Only 1.4% of them resumed tweeting. That's probably because they have other places they can live online that have thrived somewhat after Twitter cracked down on them. They just maybe have no huge preference to come back. This also may be changing as we speak, as the new lax rules continue and going into the election. And QAnon accounts, about 2% of the accounts, 2% of the reinstated accounts resumed tweeting. So Sorry, no, I'm sorry. 2% of the suspended accounts came back and resumed tweeting. So it's a little confusing phrasing on that. So that's basically the numbers. This report is like a lot of numbers for kind of obvious reasons for what it set out to do, and I think there's a lot of interesting things that a lot of you will find in the marginalia in the methodology as far as the adventure was to try and get the stuff collected and trying to extract some meaning from it. But I will turn it over to Alastair now.
Great, thanks a lot, JM. I just want to say a little bit about sort of the backstory of this paper. At the start of the paper, James opens with saying like every research project is a story, and some more so than others. And it really was the case of this one. My role in all of this was I commissioned JM to do this report, but we, as he was saying, we initially planned to do something else to be able to trying to get some kind of baseline metrics to identify typical Twitter users. But then events overtook situation. And yeah, we talked about this for years. We wanted to be able to identify some kind of baseline of Twitter followers, so we could use that to compare against extremist followers, use it to, for research analysis of mis and disinformation, also content moderation. So I spent a long time trying to work out the methodology to do this, and doing trial runs, and then we start the project, and JM tells me the first month's gone really well. We've collected all the data, and but then Elon Musk finally bought Twitter, finally took over it. And so like the good news is that, well, it's working, we're collecting the data, but actually we don't know we can achieve our objective because everything was changing on Twitter. And then, you know, this is not a typical time to be able to collect the data. So we had the questions of what do you do now? And James decided to carry on collecting the data and try and document and give a snapshot of what was happening with Twitter. Because at the time, we'd no idea how this was going to play out. And to be able to collect the data and analyze it. And I think what he's really managed to do now is a rare thing of being able to document something as it was happening and be able to collect the data and then to be able to analyze it, to give us a real snapshot in time. I mean, at the time, we didn't quite know how long Twitter was going to stay as a platform, how it was going to change. But also, Musk was announcing changes as they went along. And so then there had to be adjustments to research collection ideas, but how can we test and things, what you're saying? And one of the bits I particularly liked from the report is that looking at the amnesty, when Musk gave an amnesty to previously suspended accounts, there wasn't very much detail about that. And then the way JM went out about trying to compare that to previous data sets to try and get a bit more of an idea about actually what happened, who came back, but also more importantly, suspended accounts that came back, what did they do, you know? Because there was lots of questions about if certain actors had come back, would they start tweet again? Would they still act at home or whatever? So just get more of a picture on that, but also just the sort of data on the surges that you had of new accounts at different stages of Musk takeover, but also in particularly the analysis or the comparison of accounts which were sort of COVID deny accounts and also the sort of rumor slow accounts, and then what that's being able to sort of help us and show the effects of content moderation. But I wanted to ask James, because you touched on a bit about the question of the amnesty and how we collect data. I wonder if you could just talk a bit more about actually when you decided to focus on that, how you decided to go about it, which data sets you used, and sort of trials and tribulations you had of trying to sort of implement this in real time as it was happening.
Yeah, so the reinstatements were a question I was really interested in, and you know, I went through as all of this was going on, and I could see the end of the road coming for the API. I was like desperately trying to figure out what I could do in the least amount of time possible, right? So I knew the API was ending, but I didn't know exactly when, and I just knew that I like had to anything I wanted, I'd better grab right now. So I had a couple of lists that I previously monitored, either for opportunistic reasons or for, you know, with an eye toward writing something about it later. One was a list of QAnon accounts. I collected 50,000 QAnon accounts that had QAnon hashtags in their profiles. And I grabbed those accounts right before Twitter announced its formal crackdown on QAnon a couple of years ago, and so I was able to watch as those accounts just disappeared, just blinked out of existence. So, so I had this list of 50,000 accounts that had been terminated, and I refreshed it right before Musk took over. So I was able to sort of go in and say, okay, let's confirm that these accounts are still gone. And about 25,000 of them were still gone, and another 25,000 had come back in one way or another prior to Musk taking over. So, people made appeals, they, deleted tweets that they were, told was offending, that kind of stuff. So I had 25,000 accounts that were confirmed to be deactivated in October, and then I would just monitored that periodically to sort of see what was happening as we started seeing the news of these announcements. Similarly, the alt-right accounts were from the alt-right Twitter census. I just went back and refreshed those in October, all the accounts that we used in the alt-right Twitter census, and 10% of them were gone. So, or 10,000 of those accounts were gone. So I just monitored those accounts to see who came back. And same with the other, I can't remember off the top of my head what that was. COVID disinformation. So similarly, these were accounts that I had looked at before. I was able to confirm that the accounts were gone as of October, and then I just monitored those to see what came back. So I was kind of, I was seeing Travis Brown tweeting about this stuff, which was great. He was doing great work. He had a great methodology that really surfaced a lot of accounts that had been restored, and I kind of expected these numbers to be bigger. But his approach was a snowball approach that targeted like certain networks, right? So you collect the account and then you collect the friends and interactors of those accounts. So he was collecting a particular social network of right-wing people that perhaps were more of a priority for Elon Musk. So I thought that these numbers were pretty interesting in that the activity was much less than what I expected. And the numbers of accounts that were restored were so few that really I didn't try and do any additional analysis on their activity. I do a little anecdotal kind of dive in, confirming a lot of cases, people who came back and said, I'm back because Elon Musk. I got an email from Twitter that said, you've been unsuspended. And so, we were able to see that Twitter was doing that proactively for a lot of these accounts. As far as like a real heavier network analysis, if I'd had more time, we could have maybe done something with that, but I did what I could.
Yeah. I was rereading the report and going through all the masses of data you collected, and there's a huge amount there. And there's so many little different bits and pieces of it. But before I hand back to Moira, I was just curious, what was the thing that surprised you most? Or didn't surprise you most out of it all?
Was that me or
Oh yeah,
Moira?
for you. Yeah,
Oh,
you, Jay.
sorry. I think, I was surprised that the changes were as incremental as they were. I mean, I really kind of expected because, and this is the same bias we bring into all of our activities, right? So my people in my social networks were very concerned and alarmed about Musk taking over. A lot of people were dropping Twitter in very dramatic fashion, and I expected to see more movement. And in fact, what this confirms is something that we really, I think we always kind of knew and we sort of give lip service to, but this was more visceral kind of confirmation that, most of the world is not concerned with things that we're concerned with. And most people are just go about their business until it really becomes forbiddingly difficult or impossible. I mean, in that sense, also, I will say, one of the things that we talked about in the courts of editing and peer review on this paper was, could we like go in and say like Nazis? Could we look at Nazis and see, what happened there? Because obviously that's an area of interest. And I didn't, aside from the alt-right data set, I didn't have a good basis to sort of start that analysis from. But I searched the 100,000 accounts for, 1488, obvious Nazi, any kind of obvious Nazi kind of tags. And the other thing I think it drives home is that, for all the noise that erupts around moderation and for how much an active extremist or disinformation account can cause trouble, they are a really vanishingly small percentage of the data set. So, when I searched into this 100,000, 110,000 accounts looking for overt Nazi accounts, I found 20 or 30. I mean, so those accounts, and I think, when we look at the things like the number of tweets per day and how the social networks are constructed, they're punching way above their weight in a way that I think, I didn't necessarily fully appreciate until now.
Thanks, Jim. Let me ask you a question because you talked a lot there, or you mentioned a lot there, the fact that you were sort of racing against the clock. And it was very much around this question of, okay, there's going to be major changes to the API. And you pointed to the way in which we as researchers, didn't actually know when this was going to happen or what was going to happen. I'm sure most of the people who were joining us this evening are aware that eventually it turned out that in order to collect data from Twitter, which really had been a very open platform previously, and therefore many people had relied on it, it has become next to impossible, even for like the richest institutions and researchers and what have you, to collect data from the platform using the API. What do you think the upshots of that are?
Yeah, I mean, there will still be research on Twitter, but it just creates huge methodological obstacles for anybody trying to do this now. So you're going to either have to break the rules, break the terms of service, or pay an exorbitant amount of money to do. I mean, a paper like this, 100,000 accounts really is a drop in the bucket in terms of, the size of these social media networks, but it would be in, $100,000 or more to do this report now. For me personally, I mean, I think I was really affected by it. A lot of we all have different ways of getting this data down there. You use Node Excel or something, or you use a third-party service. I mean, I use a mix of third-party services and my bespoke app, which I spent tens of thousands of dollars developing over the course of years. And that, so one effect that had, I think, where it really affects me as a researcher, and I bet affects a lot of other people, is that because I had this app sitting around, and because I had spent a lot of money on it, I was determined to wring every drop of advantage I could get out of it.
Yeah.
So, anytime anything interesting seemed to be happening on Twitter, I would just quickly grab a bunch of accounts and just sort of see what was up. So, like, when I heard that QAnon policy was going to change, I went and grabbed all the QAnon accounts and then, collected off of them. So, I was able to accumulate a lot of data that could sit around for fortuitous events like this paper, where I had these, pre-existing data sets I could look at for reinstatements. And more like that, I could just always sort of have a casual, if something was cropping up, I could look at how it was being distributed, see if it looked artificial. It just gave me like a real situational awareness, I think, that I sorely miss now. So, I have seen people have put stuff out since this paper came out, and I mean, people are still doing it, and I don't know exactly how in all these cases they're pulling it off, but people are still getting the data down. For me, this is it. I mean, this is the last Twitter census, partly because it's no longer Twitter, but also because, my app, which has driven a lot of this research over the years, is dead. And I have moved on to other research interests. So, it's ultimately, Twitter quit me at the same time I was about ready to quit it. So it kind of works out. But when I was doing the last bits of collection for this paper, I noticed it was exactly 10 years from my first Twitter paper, which I did for ICSR on white nationalists on Twitter. And so it really, it felt like a wrap to me. And also it was like kind of horrifying when I looked back at that paper and how big the white nationalist networks I studied in that paper were compared to how big they are now. It was also kind of sobering. So.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks for that, Jim. Do you think that, just to stick with this for a moment, do you have the feeling, or does anybody on the call, I guess, have the feeling and weigh in on this, or if you have any post Twitter experiences with collecting data from so-called X, etc., we'd like to hear about it. But do you feel like that maybe there's positives? Like, for example, do you feel like people who were focused on, let's say, extremism and terrorism, okay, maybe a lot of the terrorism research has moved off Twitter, even before Elon Musk took over the platform. But if we're talking about extremism, more generally, I mean, is there maybe a positive here, which is that people are actually, or are, I would say, or will be definitely forced to begin to look at other platforms? Like we were too reliant on Twitter, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have been guilty of that. I mean, Twitter is there's an opportunity cost for any network that's not Twitter, or there was. And I think, I mean, I thought about this and it sort of looked at it from time to time. Twitter's not the only platform I did research on, but it's, by far the one that I got the most traction on. I think there were the thing about Twitter was that there were a lot of things we could generalize about social media activity off of what happened on Twitter. You need to sort of make allowances for how each platform is different, the affordances on each one. But, I think that if we hadn't had Twitter for all those years, we would be much less able to really understand social network dynamics than we are now. So, it may be over, but at least we had that kind of golden age to really collect a lot of data. And, we also had, at the same time that this was going on, we had the companies building up trust and safety departments in a way, kinds of professionals that we didn't have before. So we have a lot of information from them that they shared in transparency, particularly, around the Russian disinformation networks, for instance. There were all these disclosures of accounts and content that were really enriching. And that stuff I don't think would have happened if we hadn't had the access. So the thing about I mean, the current state of Twitter is one, I think that where they're really like just would be a rich environment for study right now if we could do it. And I hope that the people who are figuring out ways to game the system are still doing that and will be doing it. I mean, I personally am done, but I really want to know how, having an outright right-wing agitator owning the platform and changing the platform to promote this stuff is affecting the environment. And what I understand from other people, and I personally do not use Twitter anymore. I keep my account alive with a retweet every couple of weeks just so they don't give the handle to some Nazi. But I'm not on there. But what I do gather is that despite the huge algorithmic boost that's being given to a lot of these accounts now, that people are still basically kind of going on along their lives and maybe not as swayed by it as we might have feared. I think that, the presidential election is going to be a real laboratory for that. So having a wild card in charge of Twitter, making up policies as he goes in the middle of what is going to be an insane election cycle in the United States, there's going to be a lot to say about that down the road. But I'm not sure. I don't feel like I have a good sense of how that's going to unfold.
Yeah, I will say I do think there's one thing here, and you sort of put it into my mind when you mentioned the transparency reports. So the European Union, as some of the people on the call may know, has a couple of new pieces of legislation that could impact on all of this, and certainly the DSA, so the Digital Services Act, I think is slowly sort of coming to be known about, and the platforms are having to pay attention to it now and whatnot. And of course, just in the last few weeks, one of the first investigations is gotten underway by the EU Commission, and it is indeed of the platform formerly known as Twitter. But an interesting part, of course, from the perspective of researchers is that The DSA does contain requirements for platforms to give access to data to researchers. Now, we're not sure how any of that is going to play out, so it's definitely something that's in process. But nonetheless, I agree with you, JM, because I think now there's wider questions, especially coming up to elections in the US, but actually also in a whole range of different jurisdictions around the world, and Twitter almost certainly has a role to play in that, and therefore we need to be hopeful that researchers have a role to play in analyzing that activity, and maybe, fingers crossed, the DSA can make that happen. There's also, for anyone who's interested, there's also a DSA transparency database that went live relatively recently, and it's possible for people to search through also, and that's a quite interesting one to look at too. Alastair, do you want to weigh in, or indeed anybody else who's online with us? Feel free to put any questions, comments, miscellaneous contributions into the webinar chat.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking what you said. I think, yeah, we've learned an awful lot from researching on Twitter over the last decade or so. But also it's sort of, it shaped, our research in a disproportionate amount of way, because it's so much easier to do research on Twitter, and maybe it sort of helps sort of make us look in different platforms. But we've also seen quite a sort of diversification of platforms. There's more platforms out there and spreading. But also, one of the things that was getting me thinking about was, as you said, some people are leaving Twitter, and some the functionality is no longer from them. But the question is, where do people go? And in terms of like academic Twitter, it used to be, it's not as much of a vibrant community as what it used to be, and it's been something that was really been helpful. For me as a young academic, to get to know people, to get to know people, to discuss things and so on. And it's questions like, where do people go now in terms of afterwards? But also, it's very interesting as well watching this happen in sort of live, with all these different platforms being launched, like Threads, and other platforms sort of in the process of being sort of launched publicly, like Blue Skies and then Mastodon and so on. Like, how difficult it is actually to replicate, for someone else to take over that mantle, and that different platforms have their own kind of sort of style and community, and none of them have actually managed to replicate what Twitter had at its height, and actually how hard it is to be able to do that. But yeah, so I don't know if anyone else got thoughts on that, or JM and Moira, where else are you discussing academic things apart from on Twitter these days?
Yeah, I'm on all the platforms except for Twitter, and it certainly hasn't replaced Twitter for me. I mean, I think, those of you who have been with me a while know that I probably wouldn't have the career I have without Twitter. I was, an independent person blogging and tweeting, back in, 2009, 2010. And it was by being on Twitter, I met other people who were working in this stuff professionally, and it really, my online presence really led to this becoming a professional pursuit for me instead of a hobby. And a hobby I took up while I was unemployed. So it was, Twitter, I will say, really, just made a tremendous difference to me, both, in terms of my actual research of it, but also in terms of what it did for me as a social network. And, I'm happily, established enough now that I can do a lot of the work that I do without having to have Twitter. But you can clearly see how much I can clearly see from my perspective as an author and somebody who's publishing in academic stuff. I can see that my reach is dramatically lower than it was when I had Twitter. And so I have to work, 5 times as hard to get a fifth of the amount of engagement. So I'm on LinkedIn. A lot of people in our field are on LinkedIn. Not many really use it, I think, in any kind of interesting way, but they're there and they read things. That's a place where I'll get more kind of obvious clicks than other places. I'm on Blue Sky, which feels like Twitter 2009, 2010 in a lot of ways. It's kind of from the sort of emotional, social kind of standpoint, that's the one that's really taken the place of Twitter for me. That's the one that I go to first, and where I talk to people and interact with people. Some of us, the extremism community, are on there. many of us are on there but not active. You know, there are a handful of people who I knew from before who are on there and fairly active. So, you know, it's better than nothing. Threads, some people seem to have really good experience with Threads. I haven't. I was never very good at Facebook either. So, you know, I don't know if it's just an extension of that, but the vibe and the number of people that I'm interested in following are both pretty in the basement over there.
Yeah.
Mastodon has a lot of stuff that I'm interested in, but it's also a weird kind of unfriendly culture. I think when, you know, there's going to be interoperability between Threads and Mastodon soon, I think that'll be better. The thing, you know, the other piece, and then Substack was going great for a while until it wasn't. So, and that really highlights the thing that's coming up is none of these companies really have trust and safety apparatus that they need. Threads, it has the most, and Blue Sky probably has the least, but Blue Sky is currently still invitation only, so it's a small network with a fairly insular kind of group of people who already know each other. None of these platforms would be able to moderate at scale the way Twitter used to. So even though Blue Sky is like very cozy kind of place for me right now, when they go public, yeah, and start just taking anybody who wants to sign up, there's going to be problems. And the federated model, which Threads, Mastodon, and Blue Sky are all federated, so they don't, you know, it's not a centralized authority, one platform, one website kind of thing. And so that creates new challenges in moderation. The point of being federated is to defeat moderation in a lot of ways. People will, you know, pitch that as a civic good, and I think sincerely, you know, well, if it's not one company controlling everything, then, you know, you can't force activists offline or, you know, oppress the peoples. And like, yeah, that's true, but, you know, you also have to deal with trolls and Nazis and, you know, child abusers and shit posters, and, you know, it's just going to be having zero ability to moderate centrally and having very limited tools for you to control your feed locally. I don't know what the long-term outlook for any of these places is unless they're willing to invest in trust and safety.
Yeah, yeah, interesting points. And as we know, in fact, so there's the whole the decentralized web and what have you, and the trust and safety issues there, the content moderation issues there, and then there's the wholesale letting go of trust and safety professionals. Actually, it appeared to me in some ways, in the wake of decisions taken by Elon Musk, others in a fairly strategic sort of way decided to follow. So in a situation where there's going to be, like we said already, a massive number of elections in 2024. It's a blockbuster election year. It's also going to be a blockbuster year for dis and misinformation, not to say also extremism. And the trend is not upwards as regards trust and safety professionals. The trend is definitely downwards, which I think should definitely concern all of us. One of the things that struck me and was surprising to me, going back to surprising findings, is I did not foresee the LinkedIn, the sudden use of LinkedIn for sort of quasi Twitter-like purposes. But it seems to be growing for precisely those reasons, which is interesting. Threads is an interesting one too, because it wasn't able to be used by users in the European Union until relatively recently. And I thought there might be a big upswing once it could be used, but it looks like that's not the case. I'm somebody who's not a massive social media user, other than I was a pretty relatively heavy Twitter user. And like both of you, and I suspect a lot of other people on this call, I certainly found it massively useful from a professional perspective and just to know what was happening in our field and whatnot. I'm sort of taking it down. I'm going down with that ship. And just also to sort of keep an eye on what's happening there. It's interesting to me. It's not good, obviously. But you know, I certainly do feel like, and I wonder what you think about this. Also, going back to your findings from the report, JM. I mean, one of the things that happens, and we've seen this previously, is that people don't go somewhere else. They stick with what they know, and when that's no longer available, there is no other place, and they just sort of drop off. In this case, sort of drop off the social media scene. And I have a feeling that's fairly highly likely.
I think that probably is a lot of people are probably taking that approach, and to some extent, I mean, it's certainly my expectations and my level of engagement have not been the same. Blue Sky has sort of sucked me into the point where I'm starting to use it like I use Twitter, for better or for worse, including getting into pointless arguments and, you know, a lot of stuff that maybe isn't as productive. I have switched back to RSS, getting my news from RSS feeds. You know, I never completely abandoned that. I still have a fairly good collection of sources, both extremist and otherwise, and so I monitor a lot of that stuff through an RSS reader. You know, I think it's tough because the engagement is just getting clicks, getting people to read something, getting people to show up for a webinar like this. Twitter was really good at that, and it is much harder to generate that stuff. And so I'm doing, you know, I'm still doing the work. I had a paper out, you know, late last year on lawful extremism that I was very excited about, and it's the kind of thing, a topic I think that would produce some real, you know, strong opinions and argument. And on Twitter, that would have been, you know, I would have been spending weeks arguing with people about that paper. And, you know, now people have read it. People are kind enough to like reach out to me individually and let me know that they've read it and that they like it, but it's like, you know, it's not the same. So I don't know, haven't fully assimilated that, and I haven't figured out how to, you know, I might be willing to give up the social part of social media at this point in my career, but if I was younger and earlier in my career, I wouldn't be able to do that. And you know, I might have the luxury of doing it now, but I still need the clicks. So, you know, this is just, it's going to be a real process of, you know, finding out what works and how do we generate interest. You know, we're also in an environment where the quality of other non-social modes of finding out about things are dramatically declining. Google is a trash fire right now if you're trying to find any kind of credible information, and we've only just begun flooding the web with AI garbage. So Google's trajectory is almost certainly going to be downward from what is already kind of a historic low for its utility. So, you know, it's going to be a lot harder to get good information out. It's going to be harder to network. It's going to be harder to connect things. The pandemic, some of you know, I have some health concerns that have made me even more reluctant to get back out than other people. You know, but that's the other piece of it, is like I lost Twitter. We're losing Twitter after having lost a lot of in-person stuff, interactions. And so, you know, I feel more isolated from the field than I have been since, you know, almost the very beginning. I used to go down to DC a couple times a year. I used to go to Europe a couple times a year, and, you know, I would see people and find out about what's happening. And, you know, now people again are very generous with their time. People will jump on a Zoom with me or whatever. We'll use any one of 100 different ways of communicating that we have now, but it's not the same as sort of being out and spending a week with the same group of people talking about the stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah, Alastair, did you want to have any sort of a closing comment or takeaway in terms of our conversation, or indeed the report?
Yeah, well, I'm just going to add to that briefly. I'm like you more. I haven't found somewhere else to go apart from Twitter, but I am interested in seeing watching all the different other platforms emerge and try to sort of, you know, find a place. Partly from a research point of view, because I've been looking more and more at content moderation as we're seeing these more and more platforms with sizable trust and safety apparatus behind them, how they're going to tackle problems and whether they have different approaches, and actually be able to look at that and actually just you can be able to make comparative about how they to do things, hopefully in successful ways. So I think a sort of a live research thing going forward is going to be a fascinating space to watch. I mean, just to wrap it up, I think it was a fortuitous time to be doing this the research project, and it's a testimony to showing that actually, you know, you can change your research strategy as things happen to take advantage of what's going on. And in this case, actually really captured something that was really fascinating and once in a lifetime opportunity, how Twitter was changing in real time. And it's got highly recommend everyone to have a read of it and dig into all the detail because there's lots of fascinating nuggets into and lots of information. And we'll see whether it lives up to its title as the last Twitter census and where Twitter goes from now.
Yeah, thanks, Alastair. And I'll give the very last word to you, JM. I have pointed everybody to the report right there in the chat box, but it's also easily findable on the VOX-Pol website at voxpol.eu. Your last word, your last word on Twitter.
It was a wild ride, and I'm sad that it's over. We'll see what happens. I mean, you know, there are certainly imaginable outcomes where Musk loses control of the platform and it goes back to being something similar to what it was. You know, I certainly didn't see all of this coming, so I do not profess to have a perfect view on the future. You know, I'm pretty sure this is, in fact, the last Twitter census, but you never know.
I like it. Leaving the door open. Why not? Thanks, JM. Thanks, Alastair. Thanks, everybody who stuck with us for the last hour. And we point everybody in the direction of the last Twitter census. Good night, and see you all again somewhere virtually soon. Bye-bye.
Right.